In this video, you're going to connect to your MongoDB database from a Node.js application, and you're going to learn how to insert new documents into the database. Now, to get all of this done, we'll be using the MongoDB native driver. This is nothing more than an NPM module we're going to install, and it's going to allow us to interact with our database from Node. Before we actually install anything, I want to take a quick moment to pull up this module in the web so you know where it lives and you know where you can learn more. To kick things off, let's head over to the browser and explore this native driver. I'm going to close the two tabs I had open in the installation videos, and to kick things off, we'll be heading over to the MongoDB homepage at mongodb.com. Here, we're looking for their documentation section. Up top, we have docs. And once we're at the documentation, we're looking for docs about their MongoDB drivers, which is in the sidebar just a few items down. The drivers are the libraries that allow you to interact with the MongoDB database from a wide range of programming languages. Down below, they have native drivers for about a dozen or so different languages. We have C, we have Java, Node, PHP, Python, Ruby, and others. I'm going to go ahead and click Node.js to find the native drivers for the platform we're using. Now right here, the most recent release is 3.1 of the driver, and there are two links for the documentation. There's the reference, which contains more tutorials and guides about how to use features. This is essentially what we're going to cover in the videos anyways. But there is, importantly, the API documentation. This contains documentation for every single property, function, or method available with the driver. We'll be referring back to the documentation here and there as we explore new features. So we'll leave the docs up, though I'll close the other page, the MongoDB homepage. And the last thing we're going to pull up before we move into Visual Studio Code is the NPM module page. You can Google NPM MongoDB to find the package. The package name is MongoDB. This is the official native driver released by the MongoDB company. So down below, it's a very popular module with about 1 million weekly downloads, and it contains some basic instructions for getting started, and also links over to the documentation, which we actually already have open. Down below, there's other information about getting started, though we're going to work through all of that right now. So let's go ahead and create a new project, get this installed, and use it to insert some documents into the database. To do this, we're going to navigate over to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to open up a second terminal tab. We want to leave the database running. The database needs to be running in order for us to connect to it, so we don't want to shut this down. I'm going to click that plus button to open up a new tab. So right here, I now have two. One is running MongoDB, and that's going to stay as is for the duration of this project. And the other, this is where we're going to run application commands like npm install or node to start up our app. First up, let's go ahead and create a directory where we can put all of the code right here. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call this one Task Manager. Now, once we have the Task Manager directory in place, I want to use cd to navigate into that directory so I can initialize npm and I can install the module. Cd Task Manager. Once we're in the Task Manager directory, we're going to use npm init with the y flag to generate the package.json file using all of the defaults. Right here it has been created, and we can see it inside of our project root. From there, we're going to install the new module we want to use, npm I MongoDB at 3.1.10. I'm going to run the installation command, which will generate the node modules directory, and from here, we're actually ready to use the driver to connect to our database and insert some documents. Now, the Task Manager app is going to have a lot more code in the future, and we're going to have a nice advanced directory structure to stay organized. For the moment, we really just need a single script as we start to play around with MongoDB. Right here, I'm going to create a mongodb.js file, and we're going to use this file to explore all of those operations we want to be able to support. So we want to figure out how we can perform all of the CRUD operations. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. We need to be able to perform all of these operations to be able to manage our data successfully. Let's get started by importing the module we just installed. Down below, a new constant, MongoDB, which is going to store whatever comes back from requiring the MongoDB NPM library, and what comes back is an object. Now on that object, there's one thing we need to actually initialize the connection. This is known as the Mongo client. So we're going to create a new constant for that. Mongo, uppercase M, client. And we'll get that off of MongoDB dot, once again, uppercase M Mongo, uppercase C client. The Mongo client is going to give us access to the function necessary to connect to the database so we can perform our 4 basic CRUD operations. Now, before we actually get into the connection side of things, we have to define the connection URL in the database we're trying to connect to. And I'm going to do that using 2 variables. I'll have one be a constant, connection URL, which will equal a string. We'll fill the value out in just a moment. And we're going to have a second one as well, database. Once again, this will also be a string and we'll fill that value out in a second. Now for the connection URL, we want to connect to that local host server that's up and running in our first terminal tab. The value we have to provide for that is the following. It starts off with MongoDB : //. We're using their protocol. Then from there, it would be the IP address 127.0.0.1, followed by the port, which would be : and the default port we know is 27017. Now you might be wondering why I'm typing out the localhost IP instead of literally typing out localhost. That's because localhost has known to cause some really strange issues where it slows down your application and things start to fail. We're not exactly sure why that is. All we know is that when we type out the entire IP, that issue doesn't happen and the application works as expected. So I definitely recommend using the full IP right here, as it won't cause problems later in the class. Next up, the database name. We can pick whatever we want for this. I'm going to go ahead and use task-manager. If the data is for my task manager app, a database name of task manager seems appropriate enough. Now that we have this in place, we have all of the information we need to actually connect to our database. Actually, I'm going to change this from database to database name to be a little more explicit about what exactly is being stored inside of there. From here, we can now use Mongo client to connect to the server. Mongo client has one method we're going to end up using that is appropriately called connect, and connect takes in quite a few different arguments to actually set up the connection. The first is the connection URL. Now I already have that stored in a variable, so I can simply reference connection URL right here to use the following value. That is the value we're trying to use. Then as the second argument, we're going to provide an options object. Right here, we're going to be setting up a single option, which is use new URL parser. We're going to set this to true. So the URL parser that was originally used by default is being deprecated, and it's now required to pass in this option in order for our URLs to be parsed correctly so we can actually connect to the server. So that is arguments 1 and arguments 2. The last argument we're going to pass to the connect function is going to be a callback function. The callback function is going to get called when we're actually connected to the database. So connecting to the database, it is not a synchronous operation. It is indeed asynchronous. It's going to take a bit of time to get that connection set up, and the callback function will run when the connect operation is complete. Now it could either fail or succeed, and you're going to get access to different arguments depending on what happens. This callback is going to get called with either an error or with a client. If the first argument exists, that means things went wrong, and it'll contain an error message describing why it couldn't connect. If the second argument exists, that means things went well, and you're now connected to the server, and you can start to manipulate your databases. Inside of the callback function, the first thing we're going to do is handle any potential errors that occurred. Let's start with an if statement to check if an error occurred. Right here, if one did, we're just going to use console.log to print a message to the console, and we'll say something like unable to connect to database. Perfect. Now, the code below is only going to run if the connection actually worked. So to prevent this code from running when an error occurs, I'm going to use return right here to stop the function execution. So if an error occurs, we print the message, and I use return simply to stop the function from continuing to execute. That's going to ensure that the code down below only runs when things went well. And what are we going to do? For the moment, we'll just use console.log to print a message connected correctly. Perfect. If we see this, we know things went wrong. If we see this, we know things went well. Now let's go ahead and save the file and try to connect. From the terminal, I'm going to go ahead and execute our Node script. That's going to be node space MongoDB.js. I'm going to run it, and what do we get? Right here, I get connected correctly, which is fantastic. That means we were able to connect to our MongoDB server using Node.js. Now, before we go any further with the code in this file, I want to switch over to the other terminal tab where our MongoDB server is running. And you'll notice that down below, we're going to end up getting information about the connections that come and go. So right here, I see connection accepted from, and then the following IP and port. So this is letting us know that someone did indeed connect to the database. Now, it's important to note that at times you'll only have one connection, but you'll see a message saying you have 5 or 6 open connections. That's because when we connect with MongoDB, it uses a connection pool. So there's actually more connections that are opened behind the scenes, even though we've only called connect once. That makes sure that our Node.js application can still communicate quickly, even if we're trying to perform a lot of operations at the same time. So now over in the second tab where we're running our Node app, you'll notice that it's still hanging. It hasn't brought us back to the command prompt, and that's because once the connection is opened, your Node process is going to stay up and running as long as you let it, or as long as that connection remains active. We can always close the connection and shut down the Node process by using Control-C from the terminal. So there we go. We successfully connected to the database. Now it's time to insert our very first document. I'll be removing this console.log call and replacing it with some other code. The first thing we need to do is get a reference to the specific database we want to manipulate. In this case, we chose the name Task Manager. Now with MongoDB, there's no need to create this database using MongoDB or using the GUI Robo3T. Simply by picking a name and accessing it, MongoDB will automatically create it for us. So right here, what I do is use client.db. This takes as its one and only argument the name of the DB you're trying to manipulate. In our case, we stored that name in the database name variable, and what it gives you back is a database reference, typically stored in a variable called DB, which we can now use to manipulate that database. Once again, no need to create that, simply using it in the code is enough. Now we know that with our NoSQL databases like MongoDB, we don't have tables, we have collections. The next thing we need to do before we can insert a document is figure out which collection we're trying to insert the document into. We can use collections to track all of the distinct things in our application. We can have a collection for users, a collection for tasks, and a collection for anything else we might need to track. We're going to go ahead and insert a single document into a users collection. To do that, we use db.collection, and collection is a function, so we'll call it as such, and it expects the name of the collection you're trying to manipulate. In this case, let's go ahead and use users. From here, we can go ahead and call a method on that collection reference to insert a document. This is insert1. Insert1 expects an object as that first argument, and this should contain all of the data you're trying to insert. For the moment, let's go ahead and just put in 2 fields about us. We'll make ourselves the first user. I'll set name equal to my first name. And I'm also going to set age equal to my age. And there we go. we're going to insert a very simple document into that user's collection. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and save mongodb.js, and from the terminal down below, I'm going to use clear to clear the terminal output. Now let's go ahead and run our script once again, node mongodb.js, and once again, it's still going to hang out even though the operation has been completed. We're not seeing any messaging at all, which is a good thing. The only message we would ever see is if things went wrong. Now, to actually ensure that our data was inserted correctly, we can use Robo3T. That is the whole point of that administration tool. So let's go ahead and head over there to view our data. I'm going to crack open Robo3T, which is still connected to that local MongoDB database connection we set up in the last video. I'm going to close both open tabs, the Welcome tab and the one tab we used to run a command in the last video to test the connection. From here, what I'm going to do is right-click that connection and click Refresh, and you'll notice we have a brand new database showing up called Task Manager, which matches up perfectly with the database name we chose inside of our code. Now, if we actually crack that open, we can view the collections for Task Manager, and what do we have? We have a single collection, users, and users matches up perfectly with the name we chose for our collection right here on line 16 of our JavaScript file. Now we can actually look at the data stored inside of there. Simply opening it up is not enough. We have to right-click that collection, and then we can click View Documents. When we do that, it's going to grab all of the documents stored in that collection, and it's going to dump them to the GUI interface. Right here, we have a single document, and if we expand that, we can view the data stored inside of it. We have 3 fields, 2 of which we created. I have the name field with the value Andrew, and I have the age field with the value 27. Now you'll notice this third field, _ID, which we did not create. _ID stores a unique identifier for that particular document. And this is not something that's unique to MongoDB. If you've used SQL databases before, like MySQL, you know you have that ID column with the auto-incrementing integer, which goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 as you add new records into a table. With MongoDB, we also have an ID property, but it's stored on _ID. This is a unique identifier for the particular document, allowing us to identify it. Now we'll talk more about the value and what exactly an object ID is as we progress through the section. For now, all you need to know is that when you insert a document, it's going to have a unique identifier automatically generated for us, and that's a good thing. Now, from here, we can explore some other ways we can view our data in Robo3T. Up here on the top right, we are currently in the tree view. We could also switch over to the table view to view our data in a more traditional table. We also have a couple other views. We have text mode, which is not particularly useful. Typically, I'll stick with either the tree view or the table view. So now that we have one document in place, it's time to move on to the next video where we're going to continue to explore how we can insert data. And there's also going to be a challenge where you're going to have to insert data into a new collection on your own. Let's take a quick moment to recap what we did. In this video, we installed the MongoDB NPM library. This is a native driver created by the MongoDB company, allowing us to connect to a MongoDB database from Node.js. Here we used the connect method to connect to the specific server, and we used the DB method on client to get the connection for the specific database. From there, we were able to insert our one document and view it over inside of Robo3T. Let's go ahead and continue on to the next video and continue to explore insertions.